Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Shilpa Dogra. I'm a faculty member in the kinesiology program in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Ontario Tech University, and I'm one of the co-hosts for today's session. Our university is situated on the lands of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, which is covered under the Williams Treaties. I would like to acknowledge my privilege in working, living, and playing on these lands. In the spirit of truth and reconciliation, one action that I take is to donate to payyourrent.ca to support Indigenous communities. I encourage each of you to consider the different ways in which we can all commit to truth and reconciliation. So today's session, which is entitled Actions of Allies in the Academy, was really born out of a webinar that I did last year. The webinar was really focused on my colleagues in the area of kinesiology and starting a conversation regarding inclusion in our field. And I will say I was so pleased with the enthusiastic uptake of that webinar. The webinar itself sparked tons of conversations with colleagues across the country. And importantly, I think it got people thinking about of different ways in which we can be allies. The question that I got consistently, which was really interesting, and it was a genuine and sincere question, was, what can I do? And so that was really kind of what inspired today's session. I will admit that some of the what can we do that we'll be talking about today, some of these actions, are actually really quite simple and straightforward. It doesn't always have to be sort of taking a grandstand and making yourself vulnerable. There are lots of things that we can do that are really simple, that lead to an inclusive environment and are really supportive of our colleagues. So I'm hoping that today's session will provide you with some ideas and examples of things that you can adopt to become a better ally yourself, and also to help other people become better allies. I think some of these simple actions we'll be talking about today can have a really significant impact. Today's session is going to feature 5 speakers. Each speaker will have approximately 5 minutes to speak to actions that they have taken or would recommend in the spirit of allyship. Following that, we will have 20 to 30 minutes for questions. So I would encourage each of you who is attending the webinar to enter your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will be unable to monitor the comments throughout today's session, so please be sure to add your questions to the Q&A section. Okay, so I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. First up, we have Aisha Salim, who's one of my co-organizers. She's an associate professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Recreation Management at the University of Manitoba.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Next, we have Gareth Lim, an associate professor and Canada Research Chair in the Department of Medicine at Université de Montréal.
Hi, everyone.
Next is Deborah Saucier, President and Vice Chancellor of Vancouver Island University.
Hi, everyone.
And then we have Shreya Raghavan, Assistant Professor, Department of Biomedical Engineering, Texas A&M University.
Hi, everyone.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And again, thank you to all the folks who are attending. We're going to get started, and I'm going to start by handing the mic over to you, Gareth.
Okay. Thanks, Shilpa. So hi, everyone. And, it's really a great honor to be here today and to sort of be able to share my thoughts on allyship and how we can be better allies. So I guess I'll just give some examples of what I've done and, why I think it's been effective. So I started my lab here in 2016, and by nature, I'm a pretty introverted, quiet person. Just sort of like to be a wallflower, right, and just observe. I never really thought when I started my lab that I would be someone to be proactive, right, or to do things. I mean, I try and do things in a very low-key, quiet way. And so really where all sort of my efforts have really started was when I had an international student. We had some immigration type reforms here in Quebec. And I realized that as an international student, really she had no voice, right? She was a student from, an international student from Africa. She really wanted to immigrate to Canada, get her permanent residency, but because of things that had happened in the past and current political climate, she really had no voice. And, um, it dawned on me like, well, who's going to advocate for her? There was no one that she could turn to. And that was sort of like that epiphany, right? That shining moment that said, you know what, I can be supportive, I can be and help her and others, right? So, I literally I picked up the phone, called my MP, I called different levels of government that I could think of. I called the university and different departments to try and get an answer to help her out. Ultimately, she wasn't able to stay in Canada and had to go back home, but I'm happy to say that now she's actually back in Montreal. She did get her permanent residency. But that really sort of, to me, was that moment, right? That started everything. And since then, I've been pretty active and vocal with regards to EDI, supporting students and also junior faculty, and being an advocate. And I've realized that sometimes you just can't wait for things to happen. You have to be that catalyst, right? That brings forth change. And so, I've decided, well, rather than wait for things to happen, I'm going to start things here myself. So, I've organized a few activities related to EDI, trying to sort of bring to light different issues that I think we can change as a community. And I think it's paid off. I think I've sort of somewhat made some degree of change and bring forth these positive movements and within my institution and perhaps even with different research networks that I'm a part of. So to me, it's just really taking that risk, right? Because normally, like I said, it goes against sort of my character, as you will. And it's really, opened my eyes actually to a lot of different opportunities that are available and things that we can do as a community to make things better for others. Thanks.
Thank you. Next, we have Shreya.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to be on this panel. And I'm really happy to share that my concrete action is to be intentional and to be intentional around identity. And, I have sort of selfish reasons for why I got here, right? So I was an immigrant, and that was decades ago, but I was still an immigrant. And there were harsh policies around the things you could do. And so, Garrett, I resonate very much with, you wanting to advocate around people that don't have a strong voice. And, not just being an immigrant, but having to face policies and being forced out of STEM twice. So I left STEM twice before I came back to it. And I came back to it because I had very strong allies and mentors and advocates and sponsors who, were willing to go out to bat for me and say, she belongs here and she should belong here. And so we need to make this work. Tell me why this matters. And so eventually when I came back to STEM and, got my graduate degree and then did a postdoc, the whole usual route, and I started this position in January 2020, right before the pandemic. And then it seemed like, we'd all as a population maybe gotten distant and somehow disconnected despite technology. And I felt personally like I had all these identities that, I felt like I wasn't being able to bring forth. And as a mentor, I really wanted to make sure that my trainees and my mentees had that opportunity to bring forth their full selves to lab, because then they're happy, and or at least they're satisfied with not having to hide away parts of themselves. So I often start with my own identity and I say, hey, I'm an immigrant. That is my first identity. I'm a scientist. I'm an engineer. I'm here. And I, just because I look different from you doesn't mean that I don't belong. Everybody belongs. And, what are your identities? What do you value most and what do you need from me? And so oftentimes it starts with, how can I support you in the sense that you need me to brainstorm solutions with you? Or do you need me to listen to you right now and then act on that, information that you're giving me later? And this can be, um, I mean, I think an example of this would be, if somebody has a name, and thank you, Shilpa. So I want to point out that when Shilpa started this webinar, she said, teach me how to say your names right, so I can get that right. And so she actually practiced. And so one of the things that I see happening is, when somebody says names wrong, and I am now that person that will say, well, actually, let's say that right, let's correct that. And so my contribution with that intentionality is to allow people to have their identities be visible, and so they don't feel like their identities are erased in this process. And so when they feel like they belong, they are able to feel like they fully belong, I guess, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Makes sense to me for sure. For someone whose name has been mispronounced a lot. I completely understand that part for sure. Next is Aisha.
Thank you, Shilpa. And I'm going to start off by echoing what Shreya said, because what both Shreya and Garrett have said so far has resonated so strongly with me and in my journey in being where I am today. As a student from an underrepresented background, I know how hard it is to navigate the waters of academia, and you don't know what you're supposed to do, where you're supposed to go to make connections. And that's, I knew that was my process, and I wanted to make sure that my students who are coming in my lab, that I'm there to support them and to help make this easier for them. So the concrete actions that I wanted to share was actually linked with student advocacy, which seems to be a starting point for all of us as students or seeing our own students in that position. And one of the first things I did in my lab, I started in July of 2018 and got my first students in the lab a year later in 2019. And we intentionally created a lab charter of values. It seems a little, you could argue that maybe it's performative, but I would say that you have to perform an action to make sure people understand where you stand. And if you don't identify it, no one knows what are the things that you value in your lab. Is it high impact papers, or is it kindness and compassion? Is it collegiality, or is it competition? Is it honesty, or is it speed of results? So we sat down together in a lab meeting, and I started off with two things that were really important to me, and I got my students to sit with me and contribute to that charter of values. And once we penned it, it became a contract that we all hold ourselves accountable to. It's there in black and white, and you can see it. It's on the websites, in our lab manual. And we do revisit it every couple of years to try and see if we want to add something to it. And I feel like that was a great exercise for me as a lab to get my trainees on the same page as me and to let them know what I really want in this lab. What are the parameters within which I want my trainees and myself to function in? And that is, even Batman sends up a bat signal. So we got to send a signal that we are allies. And that was my signal to my students. In addition to that, and it's kind of what Dr. Leisha Strachan, who was there in the last webinar with you, Shilpa, we've been trying to create more concerted efforts to make people realize that equality is not the same as equity. And students from underrepresented groups, if we give them extra attention or different stipends or more support, it's to bring them back up, to level the playing field. So we've made efforts in our Faculty of Kinesiology to create a student stipend for equity-based purposes. And I want to take that further in future and offer it to all students from equity-seeking groups. Instead of having them compete for a couple of dollars, just make it more equitable. There are resources that we can pull together to make it happen. So those are the two concrete actions that I'm going to share, and I'll pause there. Thanks, Shilpa.
I think that's great. Thank you for sharing those ideas, and actually this issue of equity in terms of funding for students from different disciplines, different backgrounds, I think is one that we really need to start thinking about more carefully, because it does perpetuate some of the problems that we see. So thanks for sharing those ideas. Next is Deborah.
Thank you. I just want to start off by acknowledging that I'm coming to you today from the unceded territory of the Nanaimo First Nation, and I recognize that people across this video today will be coming from other nations around Turtle Island. And I just want to say thank you to the panelists and for their really thoughtful comments. I feel like I'm thinking, why did I, when I had a lab, never bother to do a charter of values with them, because it's such a great idea. And the issues around identity and ensuring voice are there. And you know, so from my position as a university administrator now, I really think that if universities want to achieve the goals that they have, that university administrators then have an essential role to play in helping people accept our responsibility to do the work we ensure to have a community founded in equity, diversity, and inclusion. And fostering that community is an important thing to do, because this helps us develop folks like you who are obviously allies in this goal. And so one of our pieces in doing that is that I believe change starts at the top, and that you have to model these kinds of actions yourself, which is why one of the strategic goals in our strategic plan was to become a more inclusive and healthier place for work and study. And Shilpa, you and I could talk about healthier at another time, but I'll just put in one small thing. If you put a whole bunch of type A people in a room, they start to compete, and we do it to ourselves. So we do have within our hands the ability to make it a healthier place to work and study. But we're talking today about inclusion, and to become a more inclusive and place, what we have to do is actually take concrete steps. And we did develop an EDI action plan that took a close look using an environmental scan at people's experiences at my university. And what we saw when we did that was that there was a clear desire for people and a clear wanting to feel that they belonged. And so we divided the work into 6 goals with concrete strategies and metrics that we report back out. And we did that very specifically because oftentimes when people come up with goals, they say things like, let's just make it better. Well, how do you know it's better? How do you figure that out? And so we have these metrics to start to understand if we're actually making it better and what better would look like, because it's not going to be the same for everybody, right? And so we really feel that we actually have to walk the walk and talk the talk on this. This is something we do. It has to become part of our culture if it's going to do this. And so the concrete thing that I think I can say that we've done in the first year of our EDI action plan to recognize the vital role that allyship plays in creating culture was to support our learners and employees to demonstrate equitable and inclusive behavior. And so we joined the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, which offers training, resources, including webinars, a diversity calendar, online resources that's free for people in our community, and you can participate in a number of ways. We also are developing a handbook on standard practice in serving learners and employees in equity serving groups in a culturally sensitive way, including things like the Positive Space Alliance, and we have a Universal Access Committee, all the kinds of things that probably exist at other institutions as well. But one of the things that I think that's clear, and this is part of what I've heard here today on the panel, is that it ensures we tell the stories of diverse learners, and we don't just tell the stories of people who fit the model, right? It's so easy to go to the person who looks like, and you can put, scientist, librarian, care worker, et cetera, and put them on the webpage as the example. And it's really important to ensure that we tell the stories of everyone. I also ensured that everybody at the level of director and above at this institution took anti-racism training, period. Everybody had to take it. And I think that's really important too, because as Canadians in particular, I find myself, and as an Indigenous Canadian who passes as white, I find myself flat-footed often when confronted with obvious racist comments or racist behaviors. I don't want to be rude, right? And my culture is one that stresses you don't want to embarrass other people in front of others. So it was really important for me to take that training to learn simple techniques like, what's your evidence for that? That's not a terrible thing to ask somebody. It's like, I ask that in scientific conferences all the time. Tell me more about this. Tell me why you think that, right? And so that's not rude, but that training gave us the tools and the skill sets to start the conversation. There's a number of other things we've done. We're part of the Dimensions Charter. We committed to the inclusive excellence principles, 7 principles that will foster this at an institution. And that's sort of a 30,000 foot piece. But if you want one concrete action, it was making every person at this university at the level of director or above take anti-racism training. And they had to take it in one of 3 sessions. Period. It wasn't like you have 6 months to do it. It was like you have this week, and everybody did it. And I think that's really talking about walking the walk at the very highest level. And I learned an awful lot of things from that piece. So thank you. I'll pause here.
Thank you. That was great. And I love that. That's a really concrete action and would have such a huge impact, because sometimes you are just dumbfounded by the comments you hear and you don't know how to respond. So I think that that's a fantastic idea. And role modeling behavior is so important. I love that, you know, moving from just committing to values and actually taking action. That's so critical, and it is challenging, but it can be done. So I'm going to take my 5 minutes or so now and focus on some actions that I've taken to be a better colleague in academia. So when I say better colleague, I'm not just referring to, you know, our faculty members, but also staff members, faculty of all levels, early career researchers, and senior professors as well. As I'm sure many of you are aware and have maybe experienced yourself, academia can feel like a very lonely place at some times. You know, you might have moved across the country to start an academic position. And that loneliness, I think, is particularly apparent for people who are the only in their faculty or in their department. And so I think there are things that we can do as colleagues to make people feel more welcome and included, and really retain that fantastic talent that these folks have. So my number one concrete action that I would recommend people do to be a better colleague is to nominate people for awards. I don't know how many times, and I'm sure you have as well, sat at a conference or at a university event and thought, you know who would be great for that award? Then nominate them, because that's what it takes to get people to get those awards. The first couple of years I was in academia, I would sit at conferences and be just angry and annoyed, thinking that, wow, a woman has never won this award, or, you know, a person of color has never won this award. And I don't know what happened. Maybe it's when I got tenure that I started to realize, you know what, I can nominate people for the awards too. And I have to say, it's one of the most gratifying things you can do as a colleague. Regardless of whether the person you nominate wins the award, they usually receive the nomination package, which includes the letters that you prepared, the information that you gathered, all of the lovely things that people have said about them. And oftentimes that, for a lot of people, is so validating and encouraging that even if they don't win the award, it's a nice gesture. Over the years, I've certainly improved my success rates with these nominations. So an action, again, that you can take in this domain is to share the nomination packages that you've put together for faculty and staff members with others who are thinking about nominating people, to give them sort of a sample. It is a lot of work. Some nomination packages require, you know, multiple letters, collecting CVs and information, and it can take quite a bit of time. But as I mentioned, it's a really gratifying action to take. And of course, this action can apply to anyone, but what we're saying today with all of our actions is we're trying to encourage you to think about being inclusive in that thought, and think about all of the folks in your faculty, including the ones from those underrepresented groups. Number 2 goes along with something Shreya mentioned, which is Say My Name. I was going to do the Beyonce singing Say My Name, but I'll save that for non-recorded sessions. I was recently at a conference and I noticed that presenters were referring to some people in their slides, Smith et al., and avoiding others. And some of it might have just been because you're referring to the seminal works in your area. But it was interesting, some names were certainly getting passed over, and I appreciate it's easy to say Smith et al., certainly easier than Klitschnik et al. Or Siva Kumaran et al. Or whatever the name might be. I also appreciate that there's some fear in mispronunciation of names, and certainly it's annoying. My name is pronounced Dogra, and I get Dogra all the time. It does drive me nuts. I'm learning ways in which I can correct people in live time in a way that's not rude. But I would rather my name be said than not said at all. So I think that that's something that we can all do, is take this simple action of learning to say names and then saying them when we're referring to people's work. We all work hard to be the first author on a paper, and so our name should be said just as much as anyone else's. And related to that point, say a person's name in the room. I think that's a really powerful thing that people can do. You can make your colleagues, your early career researchers, known by just saying their name in the right place and at the right time. So I would really encourage you to take that action. It's a really simple one, but can have quite a bit of power. The third thing I'm going to say is going to sound really basic, but actually it was reinforced by something Shreya mentioned that she started just before COVID struck. And the action is to simply go and say hi and meet every new colleague that starts in your faculty or your department, depending on the size of your institution. Not just the ones who play the same sport as you, or come from the same town as you, or are in the office next door. I hear physical activity is good for you, so take the stairs and go meet the new colleague that moved in upstairs as well. You might be thinking, well, how is this an EDI action? And I think it's just one of those things where if you apply this in sort of an inclusive manner, then it can be a really important EDI action to go say hi to everyone. And, have that little chat of like, I'm here if you need anything. If you need my third year review or tenure binder, if you need, to come to my lab and see how I run my journal club, if you want to see my charter of values as a draft, that kind of thing can be really, really helpful. And, even if you have a formal mentorship program in your department or faculty, people might not feel comfortable going to whoever they're assigned to as their mentor and might feel more comfortable coming to you. So I think that that's a simple action. Maybe none of it will go further. And like Gareth, I think most of us can relate to the fact that most academics are introverted and don't want to put themselves out there by going and saying hi to all the new folks, but I think it can be a really meaningful action. Especially as I mentioned, with COVID having started, a lot of people were just kind of left in this online world with no real support from colleagues. So it's something that you can do that's really sort of simple and straightforward. I'm going to close my more than 5 minutes now, I think, by saying that being a better colleague and a better supervisor and a better academic and, just generally being a better ally, for me, has led to receiving lots of disclosures. And I'm not sure if anyone else has had the same experience, but I get, really angry and depressed and frustrated and disillusioned when I get these disclosures. But I will say I'm always really comforted when I receive them, because it means that I'm doing something right in putting myself out there and being known as someone who will be supportive to folks who need help. I've lost my train of thought here. Sorry. I feel personally, as a Canadian who's tenured at a Canadian institution, I don't know a more privileged position you could be in our society. So for me personally, I think, well, I can use my voice and my position to speak up for other groups. And this is the part where you do become quite vulnerable in terms of putting yourself out there to speak up for others. But it is a very rewarding area to work in. And like I said, when you can be there for someone who's struggling in your faculty or in your program, it's a really good feeling to be able to help someone. So I'm going to close my 5 minutes there, and I'll hand it over to you, Aisha.
Great. Thank you so much, Shilpa. And those were some excellent ideas by, I think, everyone in the panelists. I was taking notes, even though I know it's being recorded. I couldn't stop taking notes on the side, because I'm certainly going to try and do some of the things people mentioned that I hadn't done myself. And I want to thank everyone for keeping to their time. And before I start the Q&A, I just want to say that I'm joining in from Manitoba, which is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. So what I will do is remind everyone in the webinar to of the participants to make sure that if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A, and you're more than welcome to chat with each other in the chat function, but we'll just be trying to look at the questions in the Q&A. And while you guys are putting on your thinking hats, I'm going to start off this session by opening the discussion to every member on the panel. And the first question I have is, are there actions you have taken or heard of that directly relate to the indigenization of curriculum or research in your study? So feel free to unmute or wave your hand or raise your hand if you want to go first. So I invite our panelists to share their views on this question.
I can share something that we did. When I was the director of our kinesiology program, I was able to find someone who had a similar background in terms of their training to come in and lead our group through a bit of a session and a think on what we can do to indigenize our curriculum. And I think that that's a great way of approaching it, because the person had a really good understanding of our field. And so they were able to provide really concrete examples for us in terms of things we can do in our classrooms, things we can do with regards to our slides, techniques we can use that really sort of align with Indigenous teaching and culture. And it was really meaningful in the sense that we were all able to sort of engage in it and come up with ideas together. And many of us have certainly incorporated some of those ideas into our teaching. So it's a process that I would highly recommend if you're having a retreat for your program group or your faculty, to bring someone in who has that background and can provide some of those concrete examples.
Awesome. Thank you, Shilpa. I'm just going to echo something along the lines of what Deborah was sharing earlier. I'm part of a diabetes research group at the Children's Hospital called DREAM, Diabetes Research Envisioned and Accomplished in Manitoba. And as part of that group, I was able to take an Indigenous cultural safety training, and it was an eye-opening experience for myself. I'm astounded that it wasn't taught in Canadian high school in my grade 10 history class or geography class. It was just a part of Canadian history that I never learned in school, but I had the privilege of learning that through this cultural safety training course. And I think it should be mandatory for everyone. Yeah, I would say that helped me understand those viewpoints and to actively include them in my courses and teaching. Not just the suffering and the bad part, but also the uplifting part, and balance it both out and give the students an idea of where we are, the land we are living on, and how we have to incorporate these in our learning and education going forward.
The only other thing I could add, if you don't mind, is sometimes you have to think as well about the ceremonial aspects of what you do. So for instance, presidents are installed. It's incredibly fancy and boring. But actually mine was really, really fantastic in that I went to the nation here, Snuneymuxw, and asked if we could do it in ceremony. And so right from the get-go, the most colonial thing you can do, which is install a president, we decolonized by doing it in ceremony in the longhouse, following Indigenous traditions. My robes are designed by a Snuneymuxw fashion group called Atlelam. Our chancellor was installed on the lands of the Snuneymuxw First Peoples, our nation, sorry. And so you can even disrupt things like convocation and disrupt like all of these things. And actually by doing that, show that you actually really mean it. right? And so sometimes I think people think there's, you know, I've got to figure out how to incorporate Indigenous knowledges into my coursework. And sometimes it's actually, no, disrupt the ceremonial aspects of universities as well, right? Down to how we think about conferring degrees and the like. So
That's an excellent point, Deb. 100%. It shows that it's not just a one-off thing, but it's really integrated into every part of higher education and university settings. So that's an excellent idea. And there are a couple of questions in the Q&A, which I think Deb, you already answered, which is amazing. So I do invite people, if you guys had a similar question, to check that out. Shreya, were you going to say something? Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to add a comment. Y'all know this already, but for the audience, I'm coming to you from Texas. And so we have just now reached the level of starting to do land acknowledgements. And I'm learning a lot just from being on this panel today to, you know, how to be more culturally aware of that. But our rate of awareness is just simply a lot lower, especially in Texas. So just a comment.
No, it's an excellent comment. I mean, when I was in Ontario, I never heard a land acknowledgement until I came to Manitoba in 2018. And maybe that was just a time when it started being more prevalent, but I do feel that even within Canada, while it's excellent that there's so much more awareness, there are pockets in places where it is more and places where it can be much improved. And maybe it has something to do with Manitoba having the highest Indigenous population in the country. And I think that's great. And then it's my job to make sure that I can pass it on my end to my colleagues in different parts of the country and the world as much as we can do, right?
I'm just going to build off of what Deb said as well. So ceremony is a great target, and related to that, one of the actions that I've tried to commit to, although less consistently because it's a bit more challenging, is to nominate people for honorary doctorates at your institution. There, you know, you can nominate Indigenous people and Black people and people of color for these doctorates, and then when you're in a student body at convocation that is diverse, they see that diversity on the stage as well. And I think that's a great way to start to commit to action related to EDI.
Yeah. There's actually an excellent question in the Q&A. Shilpa, do you want to read that out? Or I don't think we can ask the participant to talk, right? The webinar. Oh, you're on mute, Shilpa.
Sorry, I don't think that's an option, but I will ask the question from Luc Tremblay. Many thanks for this excellent panel and webinar. My question follows Professor Saucier's superb suggestion to use appreciative inquiry to deconstruct or challenge contrasting perspectives. On that front, are there written or video examples of actual situations? I believe that modeling and even role-playing interventions could be useful, so I would like to find some modeling resources for our people in this particular context.
So Shilpa, what I can tell you a little bit is that with our anti-racism response training, it is actually a witness-centered approach, and there are it's really highly interactive. It's unfortunately for Shreya, it's a Canadian-based sort of context with Canadian examples, but it really does start with the historical legacies of racism, white fragility, implicit bias, microaggressions, systemic racism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it actually has tools and role playing in it. I'll put the link to the training in there. I found it extraordinarily helpful because, again, you're exactly right. And thanks to Luke for the question. It really is important to practice it because we often are shocked, and you know, when it comes in your face, and it's become so much easier to say, you know, gee, that was, you know, that was a hurtful thing to say, and I think actually not a little racist, a lot racist, right? And when when you practice it, it's not so hard. So I'll put the link in the chat for people to the training. But there's also, you know, the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, and I'll put that link in too. There's lots of great webinars, videos, et cetera, there to start working on how you can become a better ally.
Thank you, Deb, for sharing all this information. That's going to be very, very helpful, I'm sure, for everyone who needs to start doing those and implementing those practices and where they work. Shreya, do you want to say something? Is that a hand up?
It was. I just wanted to add, to vocabulary, right? A lot of times, and to Garrett's point, sometimes we're introverted, and sometimes, a lot of us are non-confrontational in these sorts of situations, right? But one thing that I've realized as I rose up to be a mentor and an academic is that I did have to model how to have that conversation. So it really helped to go through trainings to be able to address sort of everyday aggressions head on. And the most useful question that I've used in those situations is just simply saying, what did you mean by that? Or can you clarify what you meant by your statement? And that's a very powerful question or phrase, because then it allows whoever made an offensive statement to sort of clarify or, come up and say, this is what I was saying. And then eventually, and the hope is that, they come to that conclusion that was an offensive and racist statement to make, or that was aggressive and, such and such by themselves. And that is something that I've learned to do now a lot more, to simply say, what did you mean by that? Pause. Can you explain what you meant by that? And that's just been a very powerful addition with simple words to my vocabulary on just going head on at some everyday aggressions.
Yeah, that's an excellent one, because I find myself freezing too in these moments. And like what Deb said, you don't want to be rude, which is so ironical because someone else did the rudeness for you and you can't even respond to it. And just asking people, what's the evidence, or what did you mean by that, or why is that funny? Hopefully that will make them reflect on their internalized biases and prejudice that they may not even realize that they have. Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for sharing those viewpoints. Shilpa, did you want to say something, or can I go on to the next?
I was going to just say that Dan had raised his hand in the list of participants, and it seems like I can allow folks to talk. So if you are interested, we can give that a try. But so people can raise their hand or add more questions to the Q&A, but maybe I'll switch gears to the next question. I'm going to ask folks if they've taken any actions to increase representation in their research participants or in their research studies. One of the things I say to all of my students in all of our health classes, unfortunately, all of the research is based on, or primarily based on middle-aged white men or whatever the case, and it's increasingly becoming frustrating. And I'm curious if other folks have done anything in their own research labs or in their studies to try and increase representation in their participant samples. Not an easy one, I know. Gareth?
So I will say the research that we do in the lab predominantly is done in cells and mice. So we don't have necessarily the, it's not a main focus, but I mean, it's, we can go back in history and look at all the studies that have been done where, drug development, for example, were done only in male and one sex, right? So now there's a big push for us in the research community in the diabetes and obesity space to make sure that we do our studies in both male and female mice. When we get patient samples, the generosity of donors, through their generosity, we try and make sure that we, do male and female, get samples from male and females, and even different ages, right? It's a big thing now to try and make sure that whatever we do, we address all the potential possibilities within our what's reasonable. But there's been quite a few studies now and articles that have come out, like even blockbuster drugs have only been done. A lot of the clinical trials were only done in one sex, and it's shocking. It totally is shocking given how much money goes into that, and it's unfortunate because then you don't realize until the very end sort of the potential pitfalls with that those kinds of studies.
Deb?
And I guess the other thing is that I would say is that to the researchers out there, if you haven't thought about it, you need to, because I sit on a number of national panels from anything from NSERC to CIHR and CFI, all of that. And you're required to actually talk about how you're addressing EDI now in your grants. And how are you encouraging this not only in your research questions, but in your mentor or your graduate students and the like. And so if you haven't thought about it, you need to, because it's going to affect your success moving forward. Even I'm aware at the level of the Strategic Science Fund that there are questions you have to answer around EDI, and that's multi-million-dollar research programs, right? And so this is coming for you. Right. It's not something you can say, well, you know, it doesn't really affect me. It will.
I'm just going to add to that. I mean, it's like I hear you, Garrett, cells and mites is hard to include gender and ethnicity, but you can at least control for sex. But I'm finding that even with cell lines, if you're using primary cells, you can investigate and find out the ethnicity of the donor, the gender, the age, and include that in your research findings, because things are so different from one. Biological reactions are different based on who you are and your history and what you've gone through. And to add to what Deb said, I review for the New Frontiers, and EDI is a big part of that grant. And if you don't put an honest effort in the EDI plan, even if you have a spectacular grant, your chances of getting funded are quite poor. I think it leads to another problem, which maybe we get time to discuss today. Some people will just put the plan together, but then not actually practice it once they get the grant. And how do we ensure that there's accountability in that process? And maybe that's something we can come back to in a bit. And I don't know why I just raised my own hand, but what I'll do is I can, I guess, go on to the next question in this and ask people if there's something we've talked about the workshops, but is there something you can recommend to motivate others to raise their voices or to better understand the importance of allyship in your research labs, workspaces?
So this might be very specific to the disciplines that I'm in, which is biomedical engineering and biomaterials. But one of the things that I encourage everyone to do is to look to their own scientific societies, because that's where most of my DEI learning has been, whether that's in pedagogy or in research. My societies have been really leading the charge for, being responsible for finding and putting out the right content and training and things like that. So I would assume that a lot of societies have similar things, and that's where I would start, for example.
That's an excellent suggestion, Shreya. Thank you.
Sorry,
Garrett, go ahead.
Just to sort of add on to what Shreya just mentioned. So every month I've been, for quite a while now, been attending a webinar series through the American Physiological Society, and I highly recommend it. It's a seminar series related to EDI, mentorship, and such, and it's really informative. It's free. It's lunchtime type seminar, so you can always just eat and watch and eat at the same time. But I think it's what I've learned through since being here, it's just really trying to be a good citizen, right? A positive role model, and ultimately, your action may not have really it's not going to be in your face, but it's just sort of planting that seed in others that you can do something, right, and make a difference. So you're really modeling, sort of trying to be that catalyst, as I was going back to. I think that's very important to try and do. There may not be a formal program, but at least you're doing something.
As a leader, you can't ask people to do what you're not willing to do yourself. I think that's so accurate. Otherwise, you're just a hypocrite in that sense, and that's probably not the thing to be. We have some excellent questions in the chat as well, and I think one of this is connected to what we're talking about. Does anyone have any thoughts about how we could expand EDI definitions and practices to include people with disabilities?
So I mean, Megan, that's an excellent question, and I was hoping we'd get to it explicitly in our EDI action plan. It does actually focus on people with disabilities, and it's absolutely part of the Dimensions Charter and part of this. Are we doing a great job of it? No. I mean, if I think about any equity deserving group in academia that is more underrepresented, I'm not sure I could think of one. So we're not doing a great job of it. But again, even things though, like making sure I work on a campus that's, I don't know, 55, some of the buildings are 55, 60 years old, and they never contemplated people who had mobility issues. My campus is 409 stairs from the bottom to the top, right? So I have access issues, like even for people with knees that are 56 years old, there's days where I'm like, I think I'm going to drive to the top of the hill rather than, right? But we're working through it with to try and make sure that we have absolutely plans in place to improve accessibility, and in doing so do that. And we also are trying very hard to ensure that people have the space to disclose what it is that they need and how can we support them. Because again, many people who have any one of a number of things that would count as a formally recognized disability are uncomfortable with disclosing it because of the prejudice against folks. Even people with hearing impairments don't often speak up for the kinds of accommodations they need and deserve legally. And so we really do need to do better. And I appreciate the question.
Yes, I 100% agree. And sure, I saw that you put an answer in the chat, but if you want to expound on that in person.
I do. And so I really just wanted to add that, you know, as a person with hidden disabilities, I think I really resonate with the lack of awareness. And a lot of it has to build upon awareness that disability is not tied to a medicalized identity, right? So it's not, I shouldn't need an accommodation if my space was designed with accessibility and inclusion in mind. And so when I teach classrooms full of 80 or 90 students, you know, what practices am I putting in place that is accessible and is inclusive? So then I don't need somebody to come and say, hey, I need this accommodation. And so I think a lot of that has to do with building awareness that disability, what disability is and what it can and cannot look like, and that, you know, it's just simply not a medicalized identity. And so moving away from that model of disability and thinking about it as how can we make our spaces more accessible? How can we make our courses more accessible, you know, and thereby improve inclusion is, I think, the direction we should sort of head towards.
And that's such a good point that you're making, being intentional about being inclusive right from the get-go. And that's something the pandemic highlighted when suddenly everyone switched to virtual work from home. As you know, we couldn't do it for molecular biology experiments, but you know, if you're working on a computer, you can do it anywhere. And I remember talking to a few colleagues who were differently abled, and they said before the pandemic, if they were to ask for these accommodations, it was a blanket no, and how could we do this, and this is not the way it's done, and suddenly everything was possible. So you got to be willing to try and change your preconceived notions of what is, you know, what is and what can be, and it's only impossible until you try it. So being open to different suggestions to accommodate and ensure that everyone can participate without even asking for that is such an important point. I know we're nearing the end of our session, but there are still some great comments and questions to get to. So I'll ask this one. It's a short one, perhaps, and I'm really interested in this. So learning about specific metrics to evaluate our own actions. So if someone, I think Deb, perhaps you mentioned about using this. If you could expand on that. This is from Asmahan Abu Arish. Yes.
Specifically, some of the metrics that we've incorporated into our EDI plan include requiring implicit and unconscious bias training for all hiring committees and all members of hiring committees. We have developed a voluntary self-identification program so we can understand who we have, because again, we only were tracking the very few aspects of equity deserving groups that we were there, and ensuring that people understand how these data will be used and how they will be held and how it will be safe to do so. Because I'll be really frank with this group, it is not safe to be a transgendered person on most university campuses, right? And yet, if we're going to support transgendered people, we have to actually, ensure that we're aware of these things. On all of our research chair recruitment processes, we have one person who's designated the EDI champion, right, who actually has to sit there and challenge some suggestions. We include EDI competencies within recruitment documentation for positions. So what are your competencies related to that? We educate search committees on EDI pieces, and we use interview questions that actually assess behavioral competency in EDI. And we also, when we onboard and orient new faculty and employees, and when we have orientation for students, we make sure that we talk about it right there. And those are just some of the specific things that we're doing to actually make sure that we're moving the bar. There are other more esoteric things that are very specific to us that I could talk about, but those are things that any university could do, right? And on any of these things, if you want to actually change it. And that's at a university level. That's maybe not at a personal level, but that's what we're doing, for example.
Fantastic ideas, Deb. Does anyone else want to add something in the last minute or so that we have left? Or anything else you want to say before we wrap up the session, Shilpa?
I was just going to say, there's a couple of things that folks said that I thought of examples of unrelated, but for example, related to gender neutral washrooms or other things on campus where if you just consulted with these people, like from these underrepresented groups, you would learn a lot and you would be able to make better decisions. I think what happens oftentimes is there's, committees or groups that are making decisions based on their own understanding or their own knowledge, and without consulting with the groups that these decisions affect, the decisions just can't be great. They can't be inclusive enough. So if you have, a new building that's being built, bring people with disabilities, people from the transgender and queer community, people from different underrepresented groups to be part of that committee to provide their insights into how even just this building structure could be made more inclusive or whatever the case might be. I think that consultation is so critical, and we, despite everything at universities taking so long in terms of actually moving forward, it seems like we make a lot of these decisions in haste without consultation. So that would be another suggestion that I have.
Fantastic. So I think I should wrap up and just thank all the panelists for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and share what you've done and give us ideas that hopefully will spark creativity on our own end. The participants who asked such excellent comments and questions, I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but hopefully we can save them and circle back in future with another webinar. And I just want to say in closing that I know that for all of us, it's not our job to do this. We signed up to be professors and researchers and teachers and work in academia and in different roles, whatever they may be, as administrators or staff. And yet we are being asked to do this. And it can be overwhelming at times. So don't think that you have to do every single one of these or any of these. Come up with one thing that speaks to you that you feel will have the most impact, that speaks to you the most, that will help your students, and do it consistently. And that's all that matters. You'll be making the world a better place. I don't think it's ever wrong to stand up and speak up for the little guy who needs help. And that will always be true. So in whatever capacity, you can be an ally, which is someone who will help, someone who needs that help. That's all that matters. So Thank you for coming and attending, and thank you for the excellent suggestions and Q&A. And again, thank you to our panelists. I learned a lot and I appreciate you being here. Thanks, everyone.